Michael Reeves had lived peacefully in the Oakwood Hills community for 5 years. He was a software engineer who worked from home, cherished his quiet neighborhood, and generally kept to himself. His modest two-story colonial with its carefully maintained lawn and simple, tasteful landscaping reflected his personality, orderly, unassuming, and without unnecessary flourish. Neighbors appreciated Michael's friendly wave and readiness to lend a tool or help bring in groceries, though he rarely attended community gatherings. All that changed when Valerie Pearson moved into the recently renovated Tudor-style home next door. Valerie, quickly dubbed Karen by the neighbors behind her back, arrived with movers in a gleaming white Range Rover and immediately set about making her presence known. Within her first week, she had distributed handwritten notes to several homes about minor compliance issues and attended her first HOA meeting with a 3-page list of community improvement suggestions. By her second month, Valerie had somehow secured a position on the HOA board through a special election when another member unexpectedly relocated. Michael, who had always paid his dues on time and followed the reasonable community guidelines, had managed to avoid direct interaction with his new neighbor, observing her flurry of activity from a safe distance. That Wednesday afternoon in early autumn, Michael returned from his weekly grocery run to find the now familiar white Range Rover parked squarely in the center of his driveway. At first, he thought he might have turned into the wrong driveway, an absurd notion since he lived there for years. But no, this was definitely his home, and that was definitely not his vehicle. He parked on the street, gathered his grocery bags, and approached his front door with a growing sense of unease. There, attached with a piece of designer washi tape, was a cream-colored note card with elegant handwriting. Emergency HOA inspection required access to your property line. Thank you for your cooperation. V. Pearson, Compliance Officer. Michael stood blinking at the note, grocery bags growing heavy in his hands. He hadn't received any email, phone call, or prior notice about an inspection. Looking around, he noticed small flags placed along the side of his yard where it met Valerie's property. Apparently, she had been measuring their shared property line. Inside his home, through his kitchen window, Michael could see Valerie and her designer athleisure wear measuring tape in hand, making notes on a clipboard as she paced along the back fence. Her face wore the concentrated expression of someone who had just discovered a serious transgression. Michael set his groceries down and debated whether to confront her immediately. Before he could decide, Valerie spotted him through the window, gave a quick, perfunctory wave with her clipboard, and headed back toward her vehicle. As she pulled out of his driveway, she rolled down her window. "You might be hearing from the board about your fence placement," she called out with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Looks like it might be 3 inches over the property line. Just giving you a heads up." With that, she drove off, leaving Michael standing in his kitchen, a carton of milk still in his hand, wondering what had just happened. He found it odd he hadn't been notified in advance about the inspection, but he shrugged it off as a one-time inconvenience. After all, if there was an actual issue with his fence, he would certainly want to address it properly. Little did Michael know this was merely the opening move in Valerie's campaign to establish dominance in the Oakwood Hills community. Michael had convinced himself the driveway incident was isolated until it happened again 9 days later. This time, he was on a video call with clients when the distinctive purr of Valerie's Range Rover broke his concentration. Through his office window, he watched her parked directly behind his car, effectively blocking him in. No gnome appeared this time. Instead, Valerie strode confidently around his property with her ever-present clipboard, photographing his garden shed and making notes. When the call ended, Michael stepped outside, determined to address the situation diplomatically. "Excuse me, Valerie. I'm not sure if you realize, but you parked me in, and I have an appointment in 30 minutes. Valerie looked up, seeming genuinely surprised by his presence despite being on his property. "Oh, Michael, I'm conducting an assessment of storage structures. As HOA compliance officer, I have temporary easement rights when conducting official business." She gestured vaguely toward his shed. "Did you get approval for that color? It seems a shade darker than the Oakwood Hills approved palette." Michael maintained his composure. "I wasn't aware of any inspection today. Could you please move your car so I can leave for my appointment?" Of course, she said, though she took another 3 minutes to finish her notes before finally moving her vehicle. That evening, Michael searched through the HOA covenant documents, scouring all 78 pages for any mention of temporary easement rights for board members. He found nothing of the sort. What he did find was a clear statement that all inspections required 48-hour written notice to homeowners. By the third incident 2 weeks later, Michael realized this was becoming a pattern. This time, Valerie had parked in his driveway while he was home, ringing his doorbell repeatedly until he answered. "Good morning, Michael," she said with practiced pleasantness. "Just doing a follow-up on those hedges." She pointed to his meticulously trimmed boxwoods. "They're still about an inch over regulation height, and I couldn't help but notice a small oil stain on your driveway near your car. Both are violations according to sections 12 and 17 of our community standards." Valerie, Michael began, struggling to maintain his professional tone. I've reviewed the HOA bylaws thoroughly. There's no provision giving board members right to park on private driveways, and inspections require advance notice. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, I'd be careful about becoming confrontational over community standards. Those violations I mentioned could result in combined fines of up to $300. As compliance officer, I'm actually trying to help you avoid those penalties by giving you a friendly heads up. Her eyes darted to his front door frame. Is that paint peeling? That might be another violation to address. As Valerie drove away, Michael noticed his neighbor Dave watching from across the street. Dave gave him a sympathetic nod. She got you too, huh? Dave called out, walking over. She cited me last month for having my garbage cans visible for an extra hour on collection day. $75 fine. Over the next few weeks, Michael discovered that most neighbors had similar stories. Bill and Janet had been cited for unapproved bird feeders. The Thompsons received warnings about their children's basketball hoop. Maria was fighting a fine for excessive holiday decorations in December. Nobody wants to challenge her, Dave explained. Brad tried last year and suddenly had 7 different violations. Eventually sold his house and moved. Michael felt a growing sense of indignation. The community he'd once enjoyed had become a place of petty tyranny, all centered around a woman who couldn't even respect basic boundaries, literal and figurative. Michael believed in solving problems through proper channels. Despite neighbors warning him it was futile, he prepared meticulously for the monthly HOA meeting, determined to address the issue professionally. He compiled a folder with dated photographs of Valerie's Range Rover in his driveway, printouts of the relevant HOA bylaws, and a reasonable proposal. Simply enforce the existing rules requiring prior notice for inspections and respect for private property. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building with uncomfortable folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Michael arrived 15 minutes early to find Valerie already there, chatting amicably with the other 4 board members. He nodded politely to everyone and took a seat in the front row. Board President Tom Wilson, a retired accountant who'd held the position for 8 years, called the meeting to order precisely at 7:00 p.m. Before we begin with general business, any community members wish to address the board? Michael raised his hand and approached the small podium when acknowledged. He felt 20 pairs of eyes on him. The 5 board members and 15 residents who bothered to attend. Good evening. I'm Michael Reeves from 347 Maple Lane, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I'd like to address an ongoing issue regarding property boundaries and notification procedures for HOA inspections. He methodically presented his evidence, 6 separate occasions when Valerie had parked in his driveway without permission, often blocking his car. He cited the bylaws requiring 48-hour written notice for all inspections. He showed time-stamped photos from his security camera. To be clear, Michael concluded, I fully support proper enforcement of our community standards. I simply request that all board members, including Ms. Pearson, follow the established procedures and respect private property boundaries. Throughout his presentation, Valerie maintained a polite smile, occasionally whispering to Tom. When Michael finished, Tom cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. We appreciate your thoroughness. The board will take your concerns under advisement. Now moving on to scheduled business. Excuse me, Michael interjected, but is there going to be any discussion or resolution regarding this matter? Tom looked uncomfortable. We'll need to review the situation more comprehensively. Perhaps we can address it at next month's meeting. Valerie spoke up, her voice honey-sweet. If I may, Tom, I believe Mr. Reeves raises some valid procedural questions. I move that we review our inspection notification practices at the next board-only strategy session. That would give us time to properly assess any misunderstandings. Seconded, said another board member quickly. All in favor? Tom asked. All hands went up. Motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. And just like that, his complaint was efficiently relegated to a closed-door meeting he couldn't attend. Several neighbors gave him sympathetic glances as he returned to his seat, his folder of evidence now seemingly useless. The meeting proceeded with discussions about repaving the tennis courts and approving Halloween decorations guidelines. Michael sat through it all, increasingly aware he'd just been masterfully outmaneuvered. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived in Michael's mailbox. Inside was formal notification of 3 separate violations. Hedge height exceeding standard by 1.5 inches, Section A, Article 12. Unauthorized driveway staining, Section C, Article 8. And improper storage structure color, Section B, Article 5. Each violation carried a $150 fine due within 30 days. That same afternoon, while preparing for an important video conference with a potential client in Boston, Michael glanced out his office window to see the white Range Rover pulling into his driveway again. This time, Valerie parked directly behind his car, completely blocking him in. When he rushed outside to ask her to move, she was already halfway down the street, clipboard in hand, examining the Rodriguez family's new mailbox. Michael's video conference was set to begin in 20 minutes. The client was considering a six-figure contract. There was no way to get his car out. Something inside Michael snapped. After somehow managing to reschedule this client meeting, Michael sat in his home office well past midnight, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his determined expression. His engineering background had taught him that every problem had a solution. It was just a matter of finding the right approach. "This isn't just about me anymore," he muttered to himself, scrolling through yet another civil engineering forum. The stories from his neighbors reveal a pattern of petty tyranny that had been unchecked for too long. If no one else could stand up to Valerie, perhaps he would have to be the one. Michael started by researching his legal options. Small claims court seemed promising until he realized how difficult it would be to prove damages. Security measures like retractable bollards or gates were either too expensive or would violate HOA regulations themselves. He needed something subtle yet effective. The breakthrough came while examining his driveway the next morning. The concrete had several cracks, and the homeowner before him had done a poor patch job in several places. He'd been planning to resurface it eventually. Why not now, with some creative modifications? Michael called his college friend Eduardo, who now ran a successful construction company specializing in creative solutions for unusual problems. "So let me get this straight," Eduardo said after Michael explained his dilemma over coffee in his kitchen. "You want a driveway that looks normal but will trap a specific vehicle without damaging it?" "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "It needs to support my Honda without issues but create problems for a much heavier SUV, specifically when parked in a certain spot." Eduardo scratched his chin thoughtfully. "We could create a section with a different substrate underneath, make it look identical to the rest, but designed to gradually compress under sustained weight over 4,000 pounds. He sketched rapidly on a napkin. The surface would remain intact, but it would create a shallow depression, maybe 4 inches deep. Not enough to damage the vehicle, but enough that it couldn't drive out without assistance. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael and Eduardo refined the design. They calculated load-bearing requirements, researched materials, and tested small-scale models in Eduardo's workshop. The final design featured a section of driveway approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, precisely where Valerie typically parked, with a special subsurface layer of compressible material sandwiched between concrete layers. "The compression will be gradual," Eduardo explained, showing Michael the final blueprints. "It'll take about 15 minutes to sink to maximum depth, just enough time for her to do whatever inspection she claims to be doing. And it won't damage her car," Michael confirmed. As much as Valerie frustrated him, he had no desire to cause actual property damage. Not at all. The chassis might rest on the concrete, but that's it. No different than getting stuck in soft ground. But you'll definitely need a tow truck to get out. They added one final feature, a remote-controlled locking mechanism that could activate the trap section. This way, Michael could control exactly when the trap would be operational. When deactivated, even a heavy vehicle could park there safely. The plan would cost several $1,000s, substantially more than a standard driveway resurfacing, but Michael considered it an investment in neighborhood justice. "One more thing," Eduardo added as they finalized arrangements. "We should install a discreet security camera. Document everything in case she tries to make legal claims afterward." Michael agreed. A weatherproof, motion-activated camera was positioned under his porch eave, providing an unobstructed view of the entire driveway. By Friday, everything was in place. Eduardo's team was scheduled to begin work Monday morning. Michael checked the HOA community calendar online and smiled. Valerie had posted that she would be out of town at a regional HOA leadership conference that entire week. Perfect timing. The Monday morning of the installation dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for pouring concrete. Michael had taken the day off work to oversee the project, and Eduardo arrived with his 3-man crew at precisely 7:30 a.m. By 8 o'clock, they had cordoned off the driveway with safety tape and begun the demolition of the old surface. "We'll need to go down about 12 inches here," Eduardo explained to Michael as he marked out a rectangular section with spray paint. "This is where the special substrate will go." The neighbors, naturally curious about the construction, stopped by throughout the day. Michael had prepared a simple explanation. Just fixing some drainage issues and cracks. Long overdue. Most nodded sympathetically, having dealt with similar home maintenance projects. Dave from across the street lingered longer than the others. "Quite an operation you've got going," he observed, watching as the crew removed chunks of old concrete. "Must be costing a pretty penny." "Worth every cent," Michael replied with a small smile. "I'm tired of water pooling after rainstorms, and certain heavy vehicles have been causing stress on the old concrete." Dave raised an eyebrow knowingly but asked no further questions. By Tuesday afternoon, the crew had excavated the special section and begun installing the complex layering system that would create the trap. First came a solid concrete base, then the compressible material in a precisely engineered grid pattern, followed by sensors connected to the remote activation system. Everything was then sealed with a waterproof membrane before the final concrete layer would be applied. The beauty of this design, Eduardo explained as they examined the work, is that when inactive, the support structures lock in place, making this section as solid as the rest. But when activated, these supports can retract slightly, allowing the compressible material to do its work. Michael nodded, impressed by the ingenuity, and from the surface, it's completely undetectable. Completely will match the color and texture perfectly with the rest of the driveway. Even up close, no one would suspect anything unusual. On Wednesday, they poured the final concrete layer. Eduardo's team used specialized tools to create a surface pattern identical to the surrounding driveway sections. They added a slight texture for traction and carefully matched the color using specialized concrete dyes. While the concrete set, the electrician connected the remote activation system to a secure app on Michael's phone. They tested it repeatedly, making microscopic adjustments until it functioned flawlessly. The compression would be gradual and silent. No sudden movements or sounds that might alert someone that anything unusual was happening. "We added one feature you didn't ask for," Eduardo mentioned as they performed a final inspection on Thursday. "See this subtle slope? If it rains, water will drain away from the trap area. No sense having rainwater compromising our work." By Friday afternoon, the new driveway was complete. Unless you knew exactly what to look for, it was impossible to tell that one section was different from the rest. The concrete had cured enough to support light traffic, though Eduardo recommended waiting another day before parking on it. The security camera was discreetly installed, its small lens barely visible beneath the porch eave, its feed connected directly to Michael's home security system for continuous recording. Michael walked Eduardo to his truck as the crew packed up their tools. Everything set on timer as requested, Eduardo confirmed quietly. "Full weight-bearing capacity will be achieved by Sunday evening, just as your uninvited guest returns from her conference." They shook hands and Michael handed over the final payment, adding a generous bonus for the crew. After Eduardo left, Michael stood in his driveway admiring the pristine new surface. From his pocket, he took out his phone and opened the new app, its interface showing a simple toggle switch currently set to inactive. His finger hovered over it momentarily. Then he smiled and put the phone away. Not yet, but soon. Michael spent the weekend catching up on work and occasionally glancing at the HOA community Facebook page where several members were posting updates from the regional conference. Sunday evening, he saw Valerie herself post a self-congratulatory message. "Honored to receive the Excellence in Compliance Award at this year's Regional HOA Leadership Summit. Excited to bring new enforcement strategies back to Oakwood Hills. #YO proud." He almost laughed out loud at the irony. A moment later, his phone dinged with a notification from his security system. Motion detected on the driveway camera. He checked the feed, but it was just a neighborhood cat crossing through. Still, it confirmed that everything was working properly. Monday morning arrived with a gentle autumn rain that cleared by 10 a.m., leaving Michael's newly poured driveway glistening in the mid-morning sun. He settled into his home office for a productive day of coding, the trap toggle still set to inactive as he waited. At 11:37 a.m., the security app on his phone alerted him again. This time, the video feed showed the white Range Rover slowing down in front of his house. Michael set aside his laptop and moved to the window, watching as Valerie expertly maneuvered her vehicle into his driveway, parking precisely where she always did, directly on top of the special section. He observed her straighten her blazer in the rearview mirror before emerging with her clipboard. Today, she wore a navy pantsuit with a gold HOA pin prominently displayed on her lapel, clearly still riding the high of her weekend award. She marched directly to his front door and rang the doorbell, not once but 3 times in rapid succession. Michael moved silently through his house to watch the feed on his tablet. From this angle, he could see her tapping her foot impatiently on his welcome mat. When no one answered, she began a methodical examination of his front porch, making notes about what appeared to be the potted plants beside his door. It was time. He opened the activation app and slid the toggle to active. Nothing visibly changed on the screen. The Range Rover remained perfectly still, and Valerie continued her inspection, moving from the porch to examine the newly poured driveway itself. She seemed to be writing something about it on her clipboard, likely preparing to cite him for not obtaining proper HOA approval for the improvement. Michael zoomed in the camera feed, focusing on the tires of the Range Rover. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Then, almost imperceptibly, he noticed the vehicle's position had changed. The front end was perhaps half an inch lower than before. The compression had begun. Valerie, oblivious to what was happening, had moved on to inspect his mailbox, measuring its height with a small tape measure. Minutes ticked by as she meticulously documented what she clearly believed were various violations. The Range Rover continued its gradual descent, now nearly 2 inches lower at the front wheels. At 11:52 a.m., Valerie finished her inspection of the front yard and turned back toward her vehicle, still completely unaware of its altered state. Michael held his breath as she approached the driver's side door. From this angle, the change wasn't immediately obvious. The depression was uniform enough that the vehicle still appeared level, just lower to the ground than normal. She reached for her door handle, and that's when she finally noticed. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as she circled her beloved Range Rover, which now sat approximately 4 inches lower than where she had parked, its chassis resting directly on the concrete surface, while the wheels sat in shallow depressions.